The biggest mistake a person can make is assuming they already know who is standing in front of them. The morning sun reflected off the glass walls of the Federal Justice Complex in downtown Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the crowded entrance plaza as attorneys, federal employees, reporters, and law enforcement officers moved through the security checkpoints. It looked like an ordinary day from a distance, but there was an unusual energy in the air, the kind that appears when something important is about to happen. Television crews were setting up equipment near the sidewalk. Government vehicles lined the curb. Conversations echoed across the plaza as people hurried toward the building. Standing near the main entrance was Officer Brandon Cole, a veteran police officer known for his confidence and his belief that he could read people at a glance. He watched the crowd carefully, scanning faces as they passed. Then his attention settled on a black woman walking toward the complex carrying a dark leather folder. Her name was Alicia Grant. She wore a simple charcoal business suit and comfortable shoes, moving with calm purpose through the crowd. Nothing about her suggested panic. Nothing about her suggested urgency. Yet something about her presence immediately irritated Brandon. He narrowed his eyes and stepped forward. "Hold it right there," he called out. Several people nearby turned to look. Alicia stopped and faced him. Her expression remained calm. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked. Brandon ignored the question. Instead, he began asking a series of sharp questions about why she was entering the federal complex. Alicia answered politely. Brandon seemed unconvinced. The exchange quickly attracted attention from people walking past. Reporters slowed down. Lawyers glanced over their shoulders. A small crowd began forming near the entrance. Alicia remained composed. Brandon became increasingly suspicious. In his mind, her calmness looked rehearsed. The more professional she appeared, the less he trusted her. "You are not going anywhere until we sort this out," he said loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Alicia glanced briefly toward the entrance of the building and then back at Brandon. "Officer," she said evenly, "are you sure you want to continue down this path?" Brandon laughed. The question sounded almost absurd to him. "I think I know exactly what I am doing." The crowd grew larger. Some people quietly pulled out their phones. Others simply watched. Imagine standing in the middle of a public plaza while dozens of strangers judge a situation they do not fully understand. Most people would become defensive. Most people would argue. Alicia did neither. She simply looked at her watch. That was what caught the attention of several observers. Not fear. Not frustration. A watch. As though she were waiting for something. Brandon noticed it too and misread the gesture completely. He interpreted it as arrogance. "You think this is funny?" he asked. Alicia did not answer immediately. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the far end of the street. The expression on her face never changed. Around them, the noise of the city continued. Traffic moved through nearby intersections. Reporters talked quietly among themselves. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds, something else was approaching. Something neither Brandon nor the crowd could see yet. And while everyone around her focused on the confrontation unfolding in front of the building, Alicia appeared focused on something entirely different. The crowd continued to grow near the entrance of the Federal Justice Complex as more people slowed their pace to see what was happening. Some assumed it was a routine security issue. Others sensed something unusual in the way the encounter was unfolding. Alicia Grant stood exactly where she had been stopped, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. The longer she remained calm, the more frustrated Brandon Cole seemed to become. He had expected resistance. He had expected excuses. Instead, he was facing someone who appeared completely unaffected by the attention gathering around them. "You seem awfully comfortable for someone being questioned," Brandon said. Alicia looked at him for a moment before answering. "Comfort comes from knowing where you stand." The response only deepened his irritation. Around them, federal employees continued entering the building, but several could not resist glancing toward the scene. A few whispered quietly to one another before continuing inside. Others lingered nearby. One reporter standing near the curb lowered her phone and studied Alicia carefully. Something about her seemed familiar, though she could not immediately place why. Imagine standing in the center of growing public scrutiny while everyone around you waits for a reaction. Most people would try to explain themselves. Most people would feel pressure. Alicia simply checked the time again. The gesture was subtle, yet it did not go unnoticed. Brandon followed her gaze to the watch on her wrist. Expecting someone? He asked sarcastically. Alicia did not answer. Instead, she looked toward the far end of the avenue where government buildings lined the horizon beneath the bright morning sky. Traffic flowed steadily through the streets. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Alicia's attention remained fixed in that direction. Nearby, two attorneys exiting a rideshare vehicle suddenly stopped walking. One of them glanced toward Alicia and immediately frowned. "Is that who I think it is?" he whispered. His colleague looked over and seemed equally surprised. Neither approached. They simply watched. Brandon remained unaware of the exchange. He was too focused on proving himself right. "You know," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "People who belong here usually do not have trouble answering simple questions." Several onlookers shifted uncomfortably. Alicia's expression remained unchanged. There was no anger, no embarrassment, no attempt to argue. If anything, she seemed patient. That patience was beginning to affect the crowd. Some who initially assumed Brandon was handling a routine situation were starting to question what they were seeing. Across the plaza, a federal employee hurried through the entrance while speaking urgently into a phone. Another individual emerged from the building moments later and scanned the area before quickly disappearing back inside. Small details, easy to miss, yet they hinted that something larger might be unfolding behind the scenes. Brandon folded his arms confidently. In his mind, he was in complete control of the situation. Alicia, however, seemed focused on a different clock entirely. Then, from somewhere beyond the intersection at the end of the street, the distant sound of approaching engines began to echo between the buildings. And for the first time that morning, a faint smile touched the corner of Alicia's mouth. The faint smile disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Alicia Grant looking calm and unreadable once again. Yet several people in the crowd had noticed it. They could not explain why, but that brief expression seemed strangely out of place for someone standing at the center of an increasingly uncomfortable confrontation. The sound of approaching engines continued to drift through the downtown streets, bouncing between the glass towers surrounding the federal justice complex. Brandon Cole heard it too, but he paid little attention. Washington was filled with government vehicles. There was nothing unusual about that. At least, that was what he believed. The crowd near the entrance had now doubled in size. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder with attorneys and federal employees. Some watched openly while others pretended not to. The situation had become impossible to ignore. Brandon seemed energized by the attention. The larger the audience became, the more determined he appeared to prove himself right. "You still have not told me why you are here," he said. Alicia looked at him calmly. "I am exactly where I need to be." The answer drew several curious glances from nearby spectators. Brandon shook his head and laughed. "That is not an answer." Alicia said nothing further. "Imagine standing in front of dozens of strangers while someone demands explanations from you, yet knowing that in only a few minutes the entire situation will look completely different. Most people would feel tempted to reveal everything. Most people would try to defend themselves." Alicia remained silent because she understood something the crowd did not. Timing matters. Across the plaza, a woman wearing a federal identification badge emerged from the building and immediately froze when she spotted Alicia. The reaction lasted only a second before she quickly reached for her phone and stepped away. Nearby, two attorneys who had been watching from a distance exchanged concerned looks. One of them appeared ready to approach before deciding against it. Brandon remained unaware of these small developments. His attention never left Alicia. "You seem very confident for someone with so many unanswered questions," he said. Alicia glanced toward the avenue again. This time the approaching vehicles were close enough for more people to notice. Several heads turned. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Dark sport utility vehicles were moving steadily through traffic several blocks away. Their windows reflected the morning sunlight, making it difficult to see inside. Nothing about them appeared dramatic. Yet something about their arrival seemed purposeful. The woman with the federal badge looked toward the vehicles and immediately lowered her phone. Another individual standing near the entrance suddenly straightened his posture. Small reactions, quiet reactions, but they were beginning to multiply. Brandon folded his arms and smiled confidently. He interpreted the crowd's growing attention as support. In reality, the mood around him was shifting. Questions were forming. Assumptions were fading. People were beginning to realize that Alicia looked less like someone trapped in a difficult situation and more like someone waiting for a scheduled appointment. The vehicles turned onto the final block leading toward the complex. Alicia checked her watch one last time. Then she looked directly at Brandon. Her voice remained calm. "Officer, there is still time to rethink this." For the first time that morning, Brandon felt a flicker of uncertainty, but before he could respond, the first dark vehicle rolled into view at the edge of the plaza. The first dark vehicle rolled smoothly to the curb in front of the Federal Justice Complex, followed by a second and then a third. The conversation across the plaza faded almost instantly. Reporters lowered their phones. Attorneys stopped walking. Federal employees paused near the entrance. Something about the convoy commanded attention without demanding it. Brandon Cole watched the vehicles arrive and felt a brief sense of confusion. Government vehicles were common in Washington, but these were different. The timing was too precise. The reactions around him were too noticeable. Yet instead of stepping back, he leaned further into his certainty. "Looks like your audience finally showed up," he said with a smirk. Alicia Grant remained calm. She adjusted the folder in her hands and looked toward the vehicles without surprise. If anything, she seemed relieved that they had arrived exactly when expected. The doors of the first vehicle opened. Several professionally dressed men and women stepped out. Their movements were coordinated but not dramatic. They carried themselves with quiet confidence. No one raised their voice. No one rushed. Yet people across the plaza immediately began paying attention. A federal employee standing near the entrance straightened his posture. Another quickly stepped aside to clear a path. Imagine watching an entire crowd react to something before you understand what they are reacting to. That was the position Brandon suddenly found himself in. The situation he believed he controlled was beginning to move in a direction he could not predict. Across the plaza, a reporter named Jennifer Mills narrowed her eyes as she studied the arriving group. She had covered federal agencies for nearly a decade. Certain details stood out immediately. The vehicles, the timing, the people exiting them. Most important of all, the way several individuals were scanning the crowd as if searching for someone specific. Not searching frantically, searching with purpose. Brandon noticed the same thing and interpreted it differently. He assumed they were there for an unrelated meeting. After all, dozens of meetings occurred inside the complex every week. There was no reason to connect them to the woman standing in front of him. At least that was what he kept telling himself. Alicia glanced at her watch again. The faintest hint of satisfaction appeared in her eyes. Not triumph, not arrogance, simply confirmation. Whatever she had expected was happening exactly according to schedule. Nearby, the woman with the federal identification badge who had earlier made a phone call suddenly looked visibly relieved. She exchanged a quick nod with one of the arriving officials. That small gesture did not escape Jennifer's notice, nor did it escape the attention of several attorneys standing nearby. Questions were multiplying throughout the crowd. Brandon folded his arms. "You still have not explained why you are here," he said. Alicia looked directly at him. Some explanations are more effective when everyone can hear them. The answer lingered in the air. Before Brandon could respond, one of the officials who had stepped from the lead vehicle began walking toward the plaza entrance. Several others followed. The crowd instinctively moved aside. Reporters exchanged nervous glances. Federal employees whispered to one another. And as the group drew closer, more than one person in the crowd began looking not at Brandon, but at Alicia, as though they suddenly suspected she was the reason those vehicles had come at all. The group continued moving across the plaza with steady purpose, and the closer they came, the more obvious it became that their arrival was affecting everyone except Brandon Cole. Attorneys who had been lingering near the entrance suddenly stepped aside. Federal employees lowered their voices. Even the reporters, normally eager to ask questions, seemed content to simply watch. Alicia Grant remained exactly where she was, her calm demeanor unchanged. The morning sunlight reflected off the glass walls of the Federal Justice Complex, casting bright patterns across the pavement as the crowd silently adjusted around the approaching officials. Brandon noticed the reactions, but interpreted them as curiosity rather than significance. "Looks like you have managed to attract quite a crowd," he said. Alicia looked at him briefly. Sometimes people pay attention when they realize something important is happening. The answer felt strangely deliberate. Several people nearby exchanged glances. A woman standing near the courthouse entrance quietly shook her head as if she already understood something Brandon did not. Imagine standing in the middle of a puzzle while everyone else has already found pieces that you cannot see. That was becoming Brandon's reality. The officials from the convoy were now only yards away. None of them appeared concerned. None of them seemed surprised by the scene unfolding before them. In fact, their expressions suggested they had expected to find exactly what they were seeing. That detail did not escape the attention of Jennifer Mills, who quickly opened her notebook. Years of covering federal agencies had taught her to recognize preparation when she saw it. These people were not arriving to investigate a surprise. They were arriving for something anticipated. Across the plaza, another black sport utility vehicle pulled into position behind the others. The driver remained inside while a passenger stepped out carrying a slim portfolio case. The sight immediately caught the attention of several federal employees. One of them whispered something under his breath and hurried toward the entrance. Brandon followed the movement with his eyes before looking back at Alicia. "You seem very confident that these people matter," he said. Alicia glanced toward the approaching group and then back at him. "I know exactly why they are here." The response landed differently this time. For the first time that morning, Brandon found himself without an immediate reply. The certainty in her voice was impossible to ignore. Around them, the crowd had stopped pretending to focus on anything else. Every conversation had faded. Every eye seemed fixed on the same approaching officials. One member of the group lifted a phone and appeared to receive a message. Another looked directly toward Alicia and nodded almost imperceptibly. The gesture lasted less than a second, but several people noticed it. Jennifer noticed it. The attorneys noticed it. Even Brandon noticed it. A feeling he had spent the entire morning dismissing now returned with greater force. Uncertainty. The officials reached the edge of the gathering crowd and slowed their pace. The plaza had become completely silent. Alicia adjusted the folder beneath her arm and took a slow breath. Her patience, her confidence, and her refusal to explain herself suddenly seemed far less mysterious than they had an hour earlier. Something was about to happen. Everyone could feel it. And as the lead official stepped forward and began scanning the crowd, his eyes settled immediately on Alicia Grant. The lead official slowed to a stop only a few feet from Alicia Grant, and the silence that settled across the plaza felt almost unreal. Hundreds of ordinary sounds still existed around them somewhere beyond the federal justice complex, but inside that gathering crowd, it seemed as though every conversation, every footstep, and every distraction had disappeared. Brandon Cole watched carefully, waiting for an explanation that would confirm he had been right all along. Instead, he found himself studying the expressions of the people around him. The attorneys looked nervous. The reporters looked fascinated. The federal employees looked relieved. None of those reactions matched the story Brandon had constructed in his mind. Alicia remained calm. She neither stepped forward nor stepped back. She simply waited. Imagine realizing that everyone else seems to understand a situation better than you do, while still trying to convince yourself that you are in control. That was where Brandon found himself now. The lead official glanced briefly at the folder under Alicia's arm before looking directly into her eyes. A moment passed between them. Not a dramatic moment. Not a theatrical moment. A professional one. The kind shared by people who already understood exactly why they were there. Several reporters immediately noticed the exchange and began writing furiously. Jennifer Mills could feel the story changing shape in real time. Whatever this was, it had become much larger than a routine confrontation outside a federal building. One of the arriving officials approached the courthouse entrance and quietly spoke with a security supervisor. Another checked his phone and nodded. Their movements were efficient and purposeful. Nothing appeared improvised. That detail stayed with Jennifer. These people were operating according to a plan. Brandon finally broke the silence. "Can someone tell me what is going on?" The question sounded different than his earlier remarks. Less confident. More urgent. No one answered immediately. The lead official looked toward him briefly and then returned his attention to Alicia. Nearby, a woman carrying a federal identification badge released a breath she seemed to have been holding for the last 20 minutes. Another employee lowered his phone and smiled faintly. Small reactions. Yet together they painted a picture Brandon could no longer ignore. Alicia glanced toward the line of dark vehicles and then back toward the official standing before her. "Right on schedule," she said quietly. The official nodded once. Traffic was lighter than expected. Several people in the crowd exchanged confused looks. The familiarity of the conversation only deepened the mystery. Brandon felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had spent the entire morning assuming Alicia was the unknown variable in the situation. Now it appeared she might be the one person who understood everything. The lead official reached inside his jacket and removed a sealed folder. The sight immediately drew the attention of nearly every reporter present. Cameras turned. Notebooks opened. Questions remained trapped behind the silence. Alicia accepted the folder without surprise. Then she looked directly at Brandon. Her expression remained calm, almost sympathetic. And as the official standing beside her finally prepared to address the crowd, the realization spread through the plaza that whatever was about to be revealed had been set in motion long before anyone arrived that morning. The lead official took a slow step forward and looked across the crowd before speaking. His voice was calm, but every word seemed to carry weight. "Thank you for your patience, everyone." The plaza remained silent. Reporters leaned forward. Attorneys stopped pretending to check their phones. Federal employees stood motionless near the entrance. Even the traffic noise from the surrounding streets seemed distant. Brandon Cole watched carefully, convinced that an explanation was finally coming. He simply did not expect that explanation to revolve around the woman standing directly in front of him. The official turned toward Alicia Grant. "Special Agent Grant, we have completed the final review." For a moment, nobody reacted. Then the words began to register. "Special Agent." The title moved through the crowd like a wave. Jennifer Mills immediately looked up from her notebook. Several attorneys exchanged stunned glances. A federal employee quietly closed his eyes as if relieved that the truth had finally surfaced. Brandon stared at Alicia, certain he had misheard. "Special Agent," he repeated under his breath. Alicia met his gaze calmly. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no desire to embarrass him, only the same steady composure she had displayed all morning. Imagine spending hours assuming someone needed to explain themselves to you, only to discover they were the one person who never owed you an explanation in the first place. The official continued. "As everyone present should know, Agent Grant has been serving as the lead coordinator for an ongoing federal operation involving multiple agencies and an extensive review process." The crowd erupted into whispers. Reporters began writing furiously. Phones appeared everywhere. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Brandon felt his confidence draining away. Lead coordinator. Federal operation. Suddenly, every strange detail from the morning began connecting. The arriving vehicles. The nervous federal employees. The urgent phone calls. The respectful nods. The reason Alicia had never panicked. She had known exactly what was happening the entire time. Alicia accepted the sealed folder and opened it carefully. Inside were documents she appeared to recognize immediately. The official nodded toward her. The operation reached completion this morning. Around them, the crowd listened with complete attention. Jennifer realized she was witnessing the moment when an ordinary public confrontation transformed into something much larger. Yet the biggest revelation had not arrived. Not even close. Brandon looked from Alicia to the official and back again. "What operation?" he asked. The question escaped before he could stop himself. The official turned toward him. His expression remained professional. "An operation that began many months ago." The answer was simple, but it landed heavily. Alicia closed the folder and held it at her side. Her eyes moved briefly across the plaza before returning to Brandon. The certainty she had carried all morning finally made sense. She had never been waiting for help. She had never been waiting to be rescued. She had been waiting for the final stage of a plan already in motion. And as the crowd absorbed the revelation that the quiet woman they had watched for hours was actually a senior federal investigator, a new realization began spreading through the plaza. The operation was complete, which meant someone, somewhere, had been the subject of that operation all along. The realization spread across the plaza slowly at first, and then all at once. The operation was complete. Those words lingered in the air long after they had been spoken. Reporters looked at one another. Attorneys exchanged quiet whispers. Federal employees who had spent the morning watching from a distance now seemed to understand why Alicia Grant had never appeared concerned. She had not been reacting to events. She had been waiting for them to reach their conclusion. Brandon Cole stood motionless. The certainty that had guided him through the morning had disappeared, replaced by questions he could no longer ignore. Imagine discovering that the story you believed you were controlling had actually begun long before you entered it. That was the position Brandon found himself in now. The lead official opened a second folder and removed several documents. He did not raise his voice. He did not make accusations. He simply described the purpose of the completed operation. For months, federal investigators had been conducting a comprehensive review involving complaints, procedural concerns, internal reports, and patterns that required independent examination. The review had crossed jurisdictions, involved multiple agencies, and generated thousands of pages of documentation. As details emerged, reporters filled notebook after notebook. Alicia listened quietly. Nothing about the information surprised her. She had helped build it. She had spent months reviewing records, interviewing witnesses, comparing timelines, and assembling facts. The crowd was learning the story for the first time. She had been living it for nearly a year. One of the officials distributed summary packets to several authorized personnel near the entrance. The movement immediately attracted attention. Brandon watched as names, dates, and findings were discussed among supervisors and administrators. Nobody appeared shocked. Many looked relieved. That detail bothered him most. The people around him were reacting as though they had been expecting this moment. Across the plaza, Jennifer Mills continued writing. Years of reporting had taught her that major stories rarely exploded without warning. They developed quietly beneath the surface until the evidence became impossible to ignore. That was exactly what she was witnessing. The operation had not appeared overnight. It had grown methodically through preparation and documentation. The lead official continued speaking. Several recommendations had already been approved. Additional reviews would follow. Oversight measures would be expanded. Administrative evaluations would move forward. Every statement pointed toward accountability through process rather than spectacle. Brandon felt the weight of those words settling around him. For the first time that morning, he began looking not at Alicia but at the people surrounding her. The respect in their expressions was unmistakable. The confidence they placed in her was equally clear. Alicia had never needed to announce who she was because the people who mattered already knew. She opened the folder she had been given and reviewed the first page. Her expression remained steady, professional, focused. The crowd watched her carefully. Some expected triumph. Others expected anger. They saw neither. Instead, they saw someone treating the conclusion of a long investigation as another responsibility to be completed. The contrast was striking. Hours earlier, she had stood alone in the center of public scrutiny. Now the truth surrounding her had become impossible to miss. And as the officials finalized their announcements and the plaza absorbed the full significance of what had been revealed, Brandon began to understand a difficult reality. The operation had never revolved around a single moment outside the federal justice complex. It had revolved around months of preparation, observation, and evidence. And somewhere within those thousands of pages was a record of choices that could no longer be ignored. The crowd remained gathered outside the federal justice complex long after the announcements ended. Reporters continued taking notes. Attorneys quietly discussed the implications of the completed review. Federal employees moved in and out of the building carrying folders and schedules, returning to the responsibilities waiting beyond the morning's events. Yet despite the activity, a strange sense of stillness lingered across the plaza. It was the feeling that follows a truth finally brought into the open. Alicia Grant closed the folder and held it comfortably at her side. Months of work had reached their conclusion. Countless hours spent reviewing records, verifying details, and assembling facts had led to this moment. There was no celebration in her expression, no sense of victory, only the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing a difficult responsibility completed properly. Imagine dedicating nearly a year to uncovering facts while knowing that many people would never see the effort behind the outcome. That was the reality Alicia understood. The public often notices the reveal. Few notice the preparation. Brandon Cole remained near the entrance, watching as the crowd slowly changed around him. Earlier that morning, people had looked toward him for direction. Now their attention had shifted elsewhere. He replayed the day in his mind, searching for the moment when everything began slipping beyond his understanding. The answer was uncomfortable. Nothing had changed. The facts had been the same all along. Only his assumptions had changed. Across the plaza, Jennifer Mills finished the final page of notes in her notebook. She already knew how she would tell the story. Not as a story about authority. Not as a story about federal agencies. Not even as a story about investigations. It was a story about perception. About the danger of believing that appearance tells you everything you need to know. Alicia began walking toward the courthouse entrance. Several federal officials nodded respectfully as she passed. Others exchanged brief professional greetings. Nobody treated her like a hero. Nobody treated her like a celebrity. They treated her like what she was, a respected professional who had done her job. That respect seemed more meaningful than any public praise. Before entering the building, Alicia paused and glanced back toward the plaza one final time. Her eyes settled briefly on Brandon. The tension that had defined the morning was gone. In its place remained only understanding. Brandon lowered his gaze. For the first time all day, he seemed less concerned with defending himself than with reflecting on the choices that had brought him there. Alicia spoke calmly. The truth does not need an audience. It only needs time. Then she turned and continued toward the entrance. The words lingered in the air long after she disappeared inside the building. Around the plaza, people slowly returned to their routines. Reporters headed for their offices. Attorneys prepared for hearings. Employees resumed their work. Life moved forward. Yet the lesson remained. Respect should never be delayed until a title is revealed. Dignity should never depend on a badge, a position, or a reputation. And as the morning gave way to afternoon beneath the Washington skyline, one truth stood above everything else. He believed authority came from the power to question others. She proved that true authority comes from the discipline to seek the truth before passing judgment.